Today, I would like to welcome you to the Versus test, where I'm going to be covering a much requested topic, the shootout between the Surface Pro 3 and the Surface Pro 4. What are they capable of in the real world? Should I buy one? And if so, which one should I buy? I'll be using the i5 models of both with the 128GB SSD and 4GB of RAM. I'll be covering the most asked questions, showing real world examples at the end and comparing the two. I'll be basing this edition of the Versus test on the things I wanted to know when I was trying to make up my mind which one to buy and whether to buy one in the first place. For example, what software can it run and can it run it properly? Is the Surface powerful enough to edit and render video, record or produce music, play games, capture games and all that good stuff? And what is the battery life like in these applications? How much faster and more powerful is the Surface Pro 4 than the 3 in the real world? CPU throttling, is it an issue on either of the units? And I'll be covering a few very quick questions like, can I run USB hubs for extra things like drives or MIDI controllers? Is the Wi-Fi any good? And accessories. Do I need a mouse? Do I need the keyboard? And then the obvious burning questions will be covered. Is it worth it? Which one should you buy? And if you already own a Surface Pro 3, should you upgrade to the Surface Pro 4? All this will be tested and answered in today's short video, so stay locked to this edition of the Versus test. Enjoy, and I hope it helps. What is currently happening YouTube? Facepalm here, your friend in Oz and NZ, bringing you reviews, tutorials and game clips, minus the shit. You can follow me on Twitter at Facepalm with a 1, not an L. As for here on YouTube, if you like what you find, then like, comment and subscribe. Don't forget to bring your game face. Let's get it done. So the first thing I wanted to cover off is what software can it run and can it run it properly? The short answer to this is anything Windows on a PC or a laptop can run, Windows on the Surface Pros can run. This is the full version of Windows with absolutely no restrictions. So the Surface Pro 3 and Surface Pro 4 both run full versions of Windows, and in my experience, all programs work as you would expect. I can install or run music program software like Ableton Live, video editing software like Sony Vegas, game capture software like the Elgato game capture system, photo editing software like Photoshop, and game clients like Steam for playing games. The only real limitation is the CPU, which in this case is also the GPU, but as you'll see, the limits can be quite high and often irrelevant. So the next question then is the Surface powerful enough to edit and render video? Is it powerful enough to record or produce music, play games, capture games, and all that good stuff? And how much faster and more powerful is the 4 when compared to the 3 in the real world? Well, we'll cover that part in a little bit, but in relation to whether you can edit video, play games, or produce music on them, the short answer is yes, and with limitations. So let's test it out. I'm going to use the programs mentioned before on the Surface Pro 3 and max them out to give you an idea of what it can and can't handle. Then in a minute, I'll compare those numbers to the Surface Pro 4 so you can see directly how they stack up against each other. First, let's test out music and audio production in Ableton Live. To do this, I'm going to come into Ableton and load in MIDI tracks one by one until the CPU meter maxes out and the audio becomes too glitchy to produce with. I'll be using the ever popular Massive Synth by Native Instruments. I'm going to have the quality set to Ultra, and I'm going to load up the Feed It To Me patch, which was kindly sent through by Justin Case of Mind Control Protocol. You can check his YouTube and SoundCloud by clicking the links popping up on the screen now. Now, if I hit play, you can see it's nice and responsive. So what I'll do is I'll keep duplicating these tracks until we hit a wall. So there's 2. Now I'll go ahead and add a 3rd, and so on and so on. So if I skip forward a bit, you can see the CPU usage meter starts to max out at around 25 tracks, and the audio starts to crack up, which would make it very difficult to produce music with. And once we get rid of that 25th track, the audio becomes playable again. So let's note down the number 24 and save that for later, as that's our limit. Now, bear in mind there are more heavily CPU-intensive synths out there like Serum or Gladiator, which load up with multi-layered CPU-intensive synth patches out of the box. And while the CPU hit is much heavier than something like Massive, you can get away with Serum and some drum loops to build tracks from, or at the very least design synth patches on the go. Also, keep in mind that you would usually use a mix of these elements, for example a drum loop and a melody loop, then maybe a synth for the bass, then a couple of other tracks with various elements including some basic effect plugins. Here is a project I loaded from a completed track also sent to me by Justin Case of Mind Control Protocol, who you can check out on SoundCloud or YouTube, and you can hear that the Surface Pro 3 is powerful enough to run it all. And for those of you wondering, I actually managed to load up pretty much bang on 500 tracks of audio with a single drum loop, all playing at the same time on the Surface Pro 3 before the audio started to crack up, so there really is no concern there. It's more of the combination of audio tracks and the synths and plugins that you will use, which will dictate how big your projects can be on the Surface Pro 3 or 4. But to sum it up, I found that the Surface Pro 3 was more than capable of creating full tracks in Ableton Live, provided you didn't go crazy and load up 10 instances of Serum and 50 drum loops. That's just crazy talk. Now, when it comes to Photoshop, I can easily edit photos and images on the Surface Pro 3, and it actually seems to be very suited to this task. Here is my gaming clips overlay I created on the Surface Pro 3. Now, because I'm not a Photoshop pro and I have tried to load up hundreds of layers in Photoshop and it still purrs along nicely, the only numbers I can really get for me are from a benchmark test, which, while they are not real world, will give us a rough idea of how much more powerful the Surface Pro 4 is over the 3. But take it from me, if you're not a professional and you're just creating thumbnails or funny pics or doing basic graphic design, then Photoshop works very, very well on the Surface Pro 3 and the 4. So the benchmark test I used was a radial blur test, which you can find to test yourself at ksimonian.com. The radial blur test automates a set of actions in sequence, in this instance, filter, blur, radial blur, with the amount set to 100, the blur method to spin, and the quality to best. Now, once the test is completed, you can note down the amount of time that it took to complete that set of actions and compare it over various systems. So if we have a look down at the bottom here, we can see that the test took 44.6 seconds on the Surface Pro 3. So I'll save that number for later and move on to video editing. So when I'm editing video on the Surface Pro 3, I am able to edit clips in Sony Vegas and preview them in real time. For example, I use the Surface Pro 3 for chopping together my plays of the day and plays of the week videos on Twitter and here on YouTube, and you can click on the link that's on screen now and you can have a look at the results. Now bear in mind that when editing things like gaming clips, you will generally only have a few layers consisting of video, pictures and audio, with lots of little chops and fades like this project. In general, fades will be a little bit laggy when you go over them, even on desktop computers, so in my experience, the Surface Pro 3 purrs along and has been able to cope with this task quite easily. But to max out Sony Vegas, I'm going to keep loading 1080p game clips on top of each other, and each one that goes on top will be at 50% opacity, so you can see them all. The preview window will be set to preview auto, and the size of the window will be 1/4 of the screen. So if I hit play with one layer active, you can see that the preview is quite smooth, and the Surface copes with it quite nicely. Then if I come over here and unmute the second layer, you can see that the playback gets a little bit laggy, but if you had to, it's still doable. Then if I unmute the third layer, it gets laggier still, but again, you could still make this manageable if you absolutely had to. But then when I go and unmute the fourth layer, quite clearly the preview starts to go frame by frame, which even at my most patient, I just wouldn't be able to deal. So let's note down the number 3 and save that for later. And what about video rendering? Well, here I'll load up my last plays of the week video project, which consists of 1080p, 60 frames per second, 40 megabyte per second MP4 files, and also a mix of PNG picture files and WAV audio files. And then I'll render it out using one-pass rendering at 30 frames per second. Once that's done, I can see that it took 22 minutes and 22 seconds, so I'll note down that time and save it for later, and we can move on to one of my favorite things to use the Surface tablet for, game capture. Now, not a lot of people know this, but I capture all of my game clips using the Elgato HD60 on my Surface Pro 3 at 40 megabytes per second, which is the highest quality possible. So, on that note of game capturing, here is the Elgato software loaded up and ready to capture. Now, as far as I've found, the only noticeable issue is when the Surface Pro 3 gets hot, and it will get hot, the CPU throttles. So what is throttling? Well, throttling is a technique used that slows down the CPU or throttles the speed of the CPU down to prevent overheating. But I'll get into that more in a bit. But as for testing, in my opinion, the actual capturing side of things can't really be broken down to a number. It either works on the highest settings, which is what you're paying for, or it doesn't. This comparison will be whether it does it smoothly or not. And I can tell you right now that on the Surface Pro 3, it's not specifically smooth, but it is still very functional. The main things I noticed is that changing between the capture and edit tab takes a moment or two, but it actually does that on a full spec desktop PC anyway. Also, when you are playing back your clips in the playback menu, it plays them back at a slower speed, and the hotter the Surface Pro 3 gets, the slower that speed can be, though it never slows to a point where you can't use it at all. The main issue that arises, and it's not actually that bad, is if you play back a clip and let it play for a bit, then click or cut on the timeline somewhere. That point won't be where the video was showing you it was. That point you clicked on will be where the video would have been if it were playing back at normal speed. For example, I play the clip from the start, and if I skip to this point, then you can see that I am here. But if I play from the start and let it play, once I get to that same point, because the playback is delayed, I will actually be here, which if I click on that point to refresh, you will see that the delayed playback point is a few seconds in the past. In reality, this was something to be aware of, but not really an issue, as you just click along the timeline to make sure you're in the right spot before cutting a clip. So the only number that I did feel is relevant is the speed at which it converts your captured clips to MP4. So here I have loaded two clips. One is a short Call of Duty Black Ops 3 clip, and the other is a 10-minute clip. If I render out the short clip of 10 seconds long, you can see here that it does it in a few seconds, 3.39 to be exact. As for the 10-minute clip, that took 49.19 seconds. So I'll write both of those numbers down and save them for later. And now on to gaming. So I run the Steam gaming client on the Surface Pro 3 without any issues, and though this does eat the battery, I'll get into that in a minute. For this test, I'll use Fraps, which will tell me the frames per second I'm getting while playing Half-Life 2. So if I start up Half-Life 2, we'll get the Valve splash screen, followed by the usual Source splash screen, and then we'll be dropped into the game. So once the menu loads up, if I come over here to the options, then click on that, and then head over to the video tab, you can see that I've got the game set to a 1920 by 1080 resolution, and then if I click on the advanced tab, you'll see that most details are set to high, and I've got the filtering mode set to anti-stropic 2x and the anti-aliasing mode set to 2x MSAA. So if I click OK and head back out of the menus, I'll come over here and load up a game. Let's pick one with an outdoor setting. So I'll load up this water hazard stage, click load, and once it's loaded up, we'll be dropped into the game. So immediately you'll notice that it all looks pretty nice, and if we grab the controls and head off the edge, you can see that the physics do in fact work as you would expect. I can shoot barrels and blow shit up. You can get reflections on the water, and we can look around as we would usually, and the hovercraft we are riding handles like you would expect it to. All in all, it's a pretty solid experience. Now keep in mind that in games, outdoor settings are generally where you'll see the graphics start to fall apart and the whole system will start to lag. And on the other end of the spectrum, indoor environments are generally lighter on the GPU. So in saying that, I found that Half-Life 2 as an experience on the Surface Pro 3 works very well and is most definitely a playable and enjoyable experience at the same time. So once we've had our fun, if we jump on out of the game and quit back out to the desktop, we'll be able to look at the Fraps score. So we'll go down here and bring up the Fraps interface, then view the location where the log is stored, minimize this, then open the Fraps log. So here we can see that the game averaged 53.85 frames per second, ran a minimum of 40 frames per second, and a maximum of 66 frames per second. But what about newer, more graphically demanding games? Well, at a 1920 by 1080 resolution with a quality set to low, here you can see the previous Tomb Raider game in action. Now obviously the Surface Pro 3 is going to struggle here, and to be honest, if you're buying this to play the latest games, then you need to get off the pills and buy a gaming PC. But as you can see, it's actually not that bad as you would think straight off the bat. The keyboard and touchpad are both reasonably responsive when you're running around the environments and looking around, and aside from little screen artifacts, the graphics hold together reasonably well. And also keep in mind that this is an outside environment again, as is most of the game, so it's going to be quite taxing on the GPU regardless, and honestly, after a few minutes you kind of just get used to it and start focusing on the storyline anyways. So now that we've seen that, let's go back out to the menu and check out our score. So if we select yes to back out of the game, we'll end up back on the desktop, and we can see that the Tomb Raider on 1920 by 1080 resolution with low quality setting managed an average frame rate of 12.35 frames per second, which is obviously quite low, a minimum of 9 frames per second, which is even lower, and a max frame rate of 18, which is not really fantastic. But let's note down those numbers and save them for later anyway. Now, at this point, I want to mention that if you want to be impressed, stick around for the Surface Pro 4 comparison results in a little bit. But for now, though, let's move on to Transistor. So we'll hit play and skip forward a little bit and jump straight into the game. And as you can see, games like Transistor and such work perfectly. And as we drop into the game here, you can see that the movement is nice and fluid, either by clicking the mouse icon where you want the red to go, or by using the keys on the keyboard to direct her. Either way, if we make our way to the other side, we'll come up to the boss and face off with him in an epic battle of graphic goodness. So if we try not to focus on the fact that I'm about to unleash what is possibly the lamest combination of attacks on this boss, and we do instead focus on the fact that I have manually set the resolution of this game to be the same as the native resolution resolution of the Surface Pro 3, which is 2160 by 1440. This in itself should give you a newfound respect for what a tablet can do with gaming. So let me repeat that. A tablet with gaming. A tablet that we can play games on. Not Solitaire, not Minesweeper, but Minecraft, Transistor, Tomb Raider, Half-Life 2. Think about that for a second and realize we are living in an exciting time. Tablets, bruh, solid game. Anyways, after we've run around a bit and tried not to get our asses handed to us, we can have a look at our Fraps score. So we can see here all our Fraps scores lined up in a row for Half-Life 2, Tomb Raider, and Transistor. Transistor pulling an average of 39.23 frames per second, a minimum of 21, and a maximum of 58 FPS. All in all for gaming, specifically gaming while on the move with a light and portable device, the Surface Pro 3 has always been great, even with the CPU throttling, which brings me to the next part. CPU throttling, and is it an issue? As I mentioned before, CPU throttling is a technique used that slows down the CPU or throttles the speed of the CPU down to prevent overheating. Now this may or may not be an issue depending on the task at hand and how hard you are pushing your CPU. So with editing video, capturing games, making music, playing games, CPU throttling kicks in pretty quick on the Surface Pro 3, and so you're kind of always doing these tasks with a throttled CPU. And even with a throttled CPU, these tasks are still doable. And one strong argument towards the pros of the Surface Pro 4 over the Surface Pro 3 is that CPU throttling and the fan noise that accompanies it takes a lot longer to kick in on the Surface Pro 4 due to the Skylake architecture of the CPU. I've been able to make tunes for 30 or 40 minutes and not have the fan kick in at all on the Surface Pro 4, whereas on the Surface Pro 3 it almost always kicks in after a couple of minutes. So another thing to take into consideration is I live in Australia, which is next to New Zealand, and it gets hot here. Fucking hot here, and I can get away with a lot more on an 18 degrees Celsius day than I can on a 40 degrees Celsius day. In saying that, I've used my Surface Pro 3 for a year, through the winter and through the summer, and there really hasn't been a day where I haven't been able to use it what I bought it for. And it's not like I'm going to be sitting outside in the direct sunlight on a 40 degree day expecting any computer to work smoothly. It's just something to bear in mind. Now, here is the disclaimer. In regards to CPU throttling and game capture using the Elgato software on the Surface Pro 3 in particular, I did notice performance issues when the CPU is throttling that can, on a very rare occasion, cause your game clips to be corrupted. Now, to put this into perspective, I've only seen this occur once or twice out of the hundreds of game clips I've recorded, and that was when I was really switching between tabs fast and trying to skip through video too quick. Now, whether this is an issue or not is up to you. If you're playing games like Black Ops 3, you can always go back and re-record the clip from the theater mode if you have to. And for me, I did lose a couple of clips, but it was no biggie. However, if this does happen and you lose the sickest clip you've ever recorded and for some reason it's not available in the theater mode, don't say I didn't warn you. But if it makes you feel any better, I will have a video up soon which will show you the best settings for capturing the highest possible quality game clips, and those are the same settings I use on the Surface Pros, which 99.9% of the time has worked flawlessly on these units. When it's up, you'll be able to click the button on the screen now and it will take you to that video. So now, in saying all of that, let's take all the data we've collected from the Surface Pro 3 and see how it stacks up against the unit that I now own and use, the Surface Pro 4. This one will be nice and simple, and for the purposes of not boring the fuck out of everyone, I'm just going to show you the results. So first up is battery life. So for all of my tests, I had the screen on 75% brightness, which is pretty much what I use all of the time. Starting with the Surface Pro 3, I ran 5 real-world battery tests from full charge to dead flat, and then compared those results to the Surface Pro 4. In test 1, I played the track from earlier on loop in Ableton, and in doing that, the battery lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes on the Surface Pro 3 and 2 hours and 55 minutes on the Surface Pro 4, which gave us an extra 9% of music production time. Test 2 was editing one of my gaming clips in Sony Vegas. Doing this, the battery lasted 2 hours and 5 minutes on the Surface Pro 3, and I saw an 8% increase on that battery life on the Surface Pro 4, which managed 2 hours and 15 minutes. For game capturing, the results were actually second for second identical, with the Surface Pro 4 maintaining that 8% increase in battery life over the Surface Pro 3. And test 4 was gameplay, playing Half-Life 2 on the Surface Pro 3 with almost max settings and a 1920 by 1080 resolution at 75% brightness. I got 1 hour and 50 minutes of gameplay, and on the Surface Pro 4 I got 2 hours and 20 minutes of gameplay, which was an 18% increase in the amount of game time. Test 5 was watching Naruto episodes, and the battery lasted lasted a whopping 6 hours and 40 minutes on the Surface Pro 3 and 7 hours and 5 minutes on the Pro 4, which actually gets us a 6% increase in battery life on the Surface Pro 4. If you want battery time for just web browsing and such, you can Google that, but off the top of my head, it's around 7 or 8, maybe 9 hours if you're absolutely lucky. But then moving on, another question I had when deciding whether to buy the Surface Pro or not was, how fast is the Wi-Fi? Well, I did a number of quick downloading and file transfer tests over my home Wi-Fi network. Now, I need to point out that the speed of internet here in Australia is not too fast compared to the rest of the world unless you live in the sticks and you have NBN already. If you take this into consideration when looking at the results, it will give you a better understanding of the Surface's Wi-Fi speeds. So for the first test, I transferred a 100 megabyte zip file from the Surface Pro 3 and 4 to my desktop PC over my home Wi-Fi network connection, and then I transferred it back again. And for reference, I transferred that same file from my Raspberry Pi to my desktop PC and back, both of which have cabled connections to my router. I also downloaded a game from Steam over Wi-Fi. The game I downloaded was Transistor and the file size was 2.5 gigabytes. And for reference, I downloaded that same game over a wired connection from my desktop PC. Then finally, I ran the trusty Ookla internet speed test across all my devices. Anyway, here are the results in table format. Keep in mind here that lower numbers are better, but higher percentages are worse as they denote a slower transfer time. If I were to sum all this up, I would say that first of all, Australian internet speeds are pretty shit when compared to our Northern Hemisphere counterparts, and you can see that the results from the internet speed test and downloading games are in fact limited by said shit internet, though the Surface Pro 4 was as fast and actually did register a ping that was in line with a cable desktop PC. But again, this was using the aforementioned internet of shit. And although the download time of Transistor through the Steam network is almost identical on the Surface Pro 4's Wi-Fi as on my desktop PC's cabled connection, the Surface Pro 3 comes in at about 10% slower. And even when transferring files over a home network where we are less constrained by our ISP's transfer speeds, across the board I would say that the Surface Pro 3 was also about 5 to 10% slower than the Pro 4. And when I compared a fully cabled connection, i.e. between the Raspberry Pi and my desktop PC, the transfer speed of that 100 megabyte file was almost twice as fast than when done over Wi-Fi, which in reality is not necessarily a shocking revelation. All in all, not really much of a difference, but the Surface Pro 4 had the advantage by around 10% over the Surface Pro 3. But just so you know, for normal web browsing, whether on a home Wi-Fi network or tethered to a phone, both Surfaces are plenty fast enough for that purpose. But let's now move on to the section that will put these units to the versus test, performance. So let's talk video and photo editing and game capture first. Bear in mind here that lower numbers mean faster, which means better. So in Sony Vegas during our layer test, the Surface Pro 3 managed 4 layers of 1080p video preview playback at the same time. Now if I compare this number to that of the Surface Pro 4, it also managed 4 layers until the playback stuttered down to frame by frame. Not really a surprising result, as this type of test comes down to the solid state hard drive also, and as the drive is similar in both units, a similar playback is to be expected. But all in all, 4 layers is nothing to be sneezed at. What I found more relevant is that video, pics and audio combined to make a video project, as you saw, work perfectly fine. On the other hand, if we look at render times, this is where the CPU will play a much bigger part. So on the Surface Pro 3, rendering out my Plays of the Week project took 22 minutes and 22 seconds. If we compare that to the Surface Pro 4, this time actually dropped to 15 minutes and 36 seconds. Now there is a noticeable result. This shows that in my test, the Surface Pro 3 takes 31% longer to render out the same 2-minute 1080p video project than the Surface Pro 4. And if we look at the Elgato game capture test, the Surface Pro 3 and 4 rendered out the 10-second clip at almost identical times, and looking at the 0.6 of a second difference there was, it is more likely a side effect of the clip loading into the buffer than anything else, so I'll leave that out of this table as I don't really think that counts. However, if we take the 49.19 seconds it took the Surface Pro 3 to render out the 10-minute clip and compare that to the much lower 35.15 seconds it took the Surface Pro 4 to do the same task, we get a much more realistic figure. A figure which shows that in my test, the Surface Pro 3's i5 CPU takes 40% more time to render out the same 1080p video project to MP4 than that of the Surface Pro 4's Skylake i5 CPU, which makes the Surface Pro 4's Skylake CPU look pretty sweet in comparison, especially if you capture a whole 10-minute match of ridiculous gaming and you want to get that MP4 file up to YouTube ASAP. Also, in general use, that laggy playback issue that plagues the Elgato software on the Surface Pro 3 is almost completely gone on the Surface Pro 4, which adds to the overall smoothness of the experience and actually helps avoid any accidental cuts in the wrong places. So for that reason also, the Surface Pro 4 has my vote and preference for this task. Now, moving on to Photoshop, the radial blur test took 44.6 seconds to complete on the Surface Pro 3 and 35.4 seconds on the Surface Pro 4, which shows the Surface Pro 3 taking 26% more time than the Surface Pro 4, which is pretty self-explanatory and kind of lines up with the other graphically intensive tests listed here. Then, if we go on to gaming, we want to keep in mind that higher numbers mean more frames per second, which means better. So Fraps measured an average frame rate of 53.85 frames per second in Half-Life 2, a minimum of 40 frames per second, and a maximum of 66 frames per second on the Surface Pro 3. On the Surface Pro 4, the average frame rate increases from 53.85 FPS, or frames per second, on the Surface Pro 3, up to 78.4 frames per second on the Surface Pro 4, which is a 46% increase in frames per second. And if we work out the minimum and maximum FPS, where the Surface Pro 4 has a minimum of 66 frames per second and a maximum of 103, we see that the Surface Pro 4 has a 65% increase in the minimum number of frames and a 56% increase in the maximum number of frames. So if we look at the amount of frames in 60 seconds across both units, it stands to reason we see an increase of 46% for the Surface Pro 4. Strangely, for transistor, the Surface Pro 3 actually got slightly better results than the Surface Pro 4, with an average frame rate of 39.2 FPS compared to the lower 33.6 FPS of the Surface Pro 4. This shows that the Surface Pro 3 had an increase of around 6 average frames per second, which is approximately 17%. As for the minimum FPS, the Surface Pro 3 got 21 FPS and the Surface Pro 4 got 18 FPS, which is again a 17% increase, but this time in the amount of minimum FPS for the Surface Pro 3. Yet the maximum FPS put the Surface Pro 4 in the lead, with the Surface Pro 3 getting 58 FPS and the Surface Pro 4 getting 61 FPS, which is an increase in 5% for the Surface Pro 4. Weird. Either way, the game is completely playable on both tablets at max settings, so honestly, I don't really care either way. But moving on to Tomb Raider, which is of course a more recent game, we did however see stats that make perfect sense. On the Surface Pro 3, the average FPS was 12.3, which is pretty low, where the Surface Pro 4's Skylake CPU architecture really showed its merit, managing an average of 27.8 FPS, which is actually pretty damn playable and shows the 15.5 FPS difference, which equates to about 126% increase on the Surface Pro 4. And looking at the minimum and maximum FPS, we can see an increase in the minimum number of frames by 13 FPS, which is 144%, and the max number of frames on the Surface Pro 3 goes from 18 to 35 on the Surface Pro 4, which at a 17 frame difference equates to roughly 94% more frames on the Surface Pro 4. Pretty good, huh? So what the fuck does this all mean? Well, realistically it means that the Surface Pro 3 and Surface Pro 4 can both run Half-Life 2 and Transistor at almost max settings with extremely smooth gameplay, which is all good. But for newer games like Tomb Raider, both units can run the game, but the Surface Pro 4's Skylake i5 CPU crushes the Surface Pro 3. And because of that, the gameplay is actually enjoyable on newer games like Tomb Raider, albeit at lower resolutions, but for gaming on the go on a tablet, it's pretty sweet. And here you can see Tomb Raider on the Surface Pro 4 in action. And if I were to sum up roughly the percentages, I would say that for video editing, rendering, game capturing, and photo editing, the Surface Pro 4 is around 30 to 40% better than the Surface Pro 3. And when it comes to gaming itself, the Surface Pro 4 as a generalization, and depending on the game obviously, is around about 50 to 100% better than the Surface Pro 3. And so my vote on this one goes to the Surface Pro 4. Then if we finally move on to audio production, I found that you could easily make a full sounding track with various synths, plugins, and drum loops on the Surface Pro 3 and the Surface Pro 4. But when it came to testing the CPU out, I found that I could load up 24 instances of the massive synth by Native Instruments with a patch and playing a loop on the Surface Pro 3, and on the Surface Pro 4 I managed 32 instances before the audio started cracking up. So that's a 33% increase for the Surface Pro 4. Then when I load up a CPU intensive synth like Serum. When I was sitting idle, it used about 9% CPU on the Surface Pro 3 and a measly 4% CPU on the Surface Pro 4, which means that I could load up theoretically 11 instances on the Surface Pro 3 and 22 instances on the Surface Pro 4, which is a 100% increase, i.e. twice as good. So if I were to weigh it up, taking all that into account, I would say that makes the Surface Pro 4, in my eyes at least, about 40% better for audio production. Now, the only other quick things I was thinking about when I was looking at buying one of these units was, can I run USB hubs for MIDI? Again, the short answer is yes. Yes, it can. USB hubs work as you would expect on both the Surface Pro 3 and 4, and you can use the USB port for MIDI controllers with music production software, and you can even run multiple MIDI controllers with a USB hub from the single USB 3 port on the Surface Pro. Also, I was wondering about accessories. Do I need the mouse and do I need a keyboard? Let me put it this way, you don't need them, but it's a shitload better with them. And for me at least, the keyboard is 100% essential for tasks. As for the mouse aspect, I used the trackpad for a month and actually to type up the script for this tutorial. Then I used a wired mouse for a week. Then I bought the Microsoft Surface Touch Bluetooth mouse, and that, my friends, was easily the best way to go. I highly recommend the Surface mouse because it works perfect, has long battery life, frees up your USB 3 port and snaps flat to store perfectly with your Surface in a carry bag or carry case. And as for the official Surface carry case, I didn't buy the Surface specific bag because A, it was expensive for what it was, and B, it doesn't have enough room for all the extra cables, etc. that I like to keep with me. I actually use a neoprene case for a 13-inch laptop as it fits all my cables, etc. So happy days. And finally, the pen. The pen is brilliant on the Surface Pro 3, but on the Surface Pro 4, it's absolute perfection. Now, I don't use it a lot due to what I do, but a friend of mine is an artist, and he said that it works insanely well for sketching up tattoo stencils prior to tattooing his customers. So take from that what you will. And so, on to what I think you should do in regards to the Surface tablets and whether or not you should buy one. So, in a nutshell, as I see it, you currently have 4 options. Option 1, don't buy a Surface Pro, buy a laptop or a desktop. Honestly, if you're on a tight budget and you don't mind carrying around the extra weight, then you're probably better off doing that. Option 2, you have a Surface Pro 3 already and you're wondering whether to upgrade. Then you can do what I did, sell the Surface Pro 3 while it's still worth something, wait for a cracking deal to come up at a retailer, and the difference will only be a few $100. In this case, and in my opinion, the upgrade is 100% worth it. My audio and video editing projects don't feel limited by the Surface Pro 4's CPU so much. Gaming is much smoother on newer games, and the big one for me, game capturing is a smooth and flawless desktop-like experience. However, if you are only dabbling in audio and video production, only play older games like Half-Life 2, or the newer games that you do play are not graphically demanding, then probably stick with the Surface Pro 3. But for me, upgrade. On top of the performance perks, the trackpad is much bigger and better, the keys on the keyboard are 10 times better to use, the pen is better, and the performance is cracking. Or you fall into the last pot, where you don't have either, but you love the idea of a tablet that is light, small, and can run all your Windows software, and you can actually afford the asking price. You can, in that case, take option 3, which is buy a used Surface Pro 3 from eBay and save a couple of $100. Or option 4, spend the extra and get the Surface Pro 4 brand new or even used. For me, again, the answer is simple. Get the Surface Pro 4. It's a much better overall experience, and the performance increase, even on the i5 models, more than justifies the asking price. Obviously consider what you will use it for, but if you really want to get your money's worth, you should at least be gaming on it, producing audio or video, editing in Photoshop, or capturing game clips for upload to YouTube on it. Or ideally, all of the above. And for that, the Surface Pro 4 i5 model with 128GB SSD and 4GB of RAM is where the sweet spot is. Especially considering you can jam a 64GB micro SD card in the back of the Surface like I have to increase your storage up to 192GB, or more accurately 176GB of usable storage space. Like Shia LaBeouf. Do it! So after all of that, I hope this has helped, and I wish you all the best for your future purchase. Seriously though, buy the Surface 4. Good luck and good gaming. Thanks for watching today's video. Just remember you can follow me on Twitter @facepalm with a 1, not an L. As for here on YouTube, if you like what you find, then like, comment and subscribe. But don't forget to bring your game face. Facepalm out.